The police failed to properly examine and assess the crime scene where Barry and Honey Sherman were located in the basement by the pool. They failed to recognize the suspicious and staged manner in which their bodies were situated.
Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this video right here, we're going to look into the case of Barry and Honey Sherman. They were billionaires.
With a B.
And in 2017, Barry Sherman was the 12th wealthiest Canadian. And also in 2017, they died under very mysterious circumstances, and it remains, to date, an unsolved case. Barry Sherman had a good side and a bad side. And unsurprisingly, a lot of enemies. So, yeah, let's get into it. So let's begin with a bit of a background of who Holly and especially Barry Sherman were. In 1973, Barry Sherman started pharmaceutical company Apotex. He had worked for various other drug companies before this in Canada and the United States, but Apotex would become the big one. By 2016, as CEO of Apotex, he oversaw a company that employed over 10,000 people and had a revenue of over $1.5 billion per year. They made the generic versions of brand name drugs, and it sells hundreds of products all over the world, and is one of the largest drug manufacturers in Canada.
Multinationals are simply parasites that come into Canada, set up branch plants simply for the purpose of exploiting our market to the maximum for their own benefit.
In 1971, he married Honey Reich, whom he would stay with for the rest of his life. Together, they had 4 children. Although Barry always turned up at charity galas with Honey, he was a complete workaholic, virtually incapable of small talk, constantly getting down to brass tacks. His family lived well, and Barry had a habit of quietly writing checks to Apotex employees who'd run into financial trouble. But Barry spent next to nothing on himself. He would drive cars to work that were quite literally falling apart at the seams. The Shermans were a powerful presence in Toronto. Museums, campuses, community centres all seemed to have a space named after them or Apotex. He was a major member of Canada's political and business elite. Barry and Honey were among the country's most generous philanthropists, donating millions and supporting cultural and educational institutions, anti-poverty organizations, and, while Barry Sherman himself, he was an atheist and he didn't believe in God, a number of Jewish causes.
We wanted to help make sure that future generations would have a place that they could call home.
They were huge donors to the United Way and would regularly send millions of dollars worth of medicines to disaster zones. And this is when we get into what's called his 2 legacies. There's the good side we just went through, and then there's the bad side. Barry and his company faced many accusations that they gouged customers with high prices, and Apotex also regularly smeared its opponents. He would fundraise for Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, while at the same time lobbying the government, and he was actually under investigation for this. University of Ottawa law professor Amir Attaran said he was a deplorable human being. People tend to believe he did great things for generic drugs in Canada, but Canadians pay more for generic drugs than almost every other country. He sought to manipulate our system to enrich himself and impoverish Canadian patients who used his drugs. At one point in the 1990s, German company Bayer AG, who invented aspirin, became convinced that Barry was infringing its patents and hired private investigators to recruit Apotex employees as informants, and even raised the possibility of planting a stash of illegal drugs in his car. Of course, they later denied this totally. One particularly notable case went on for about a decade. In the mid-1990s, University of Toronto hematologist Nancy Olivieri was running clinical trials for an Apotex drug designed to treat an inherited blood disorder. As the trials went on, she came to believe the drug might be ineffective and unsafe for patients. Apotex then threatened to sue if she disclosed her concerns and criticized the quality of her work to her superiors. Discussions Apotex were having with the University of Toronto about a major donation were then suspended, and Nancy Olivieri was removed from her position. In 2011, his cousins sued him, alleging he never paid royalties and equity in Apotex. You see, Barry built Apotex from proceeds he earned when their father, which would be Barry's uncle, sold his company, which was also a pharmaceutical company.
Barry lost his father when he was 9, and my father, Uncle Lou, took him under his wing and actually brought him into the business and gave him a summer job and I guess taught him the world of generics.
The cousins sought a 20% interest in Apotex, or damages of $1 billion. Barry responded by withdrawing millions of dollars in financial assistance to his cousins. The cousins contended that Barry had offered the financial assistance in the first place in order to make the cousins dependent on him and to keep them from learning about their rights to the business.
So financially, this idea that Barry Sherman was giving me money was not the truth. I was beholden to him. I was under his thumb.
Though, of course, this was denied by Barry. In 2017, an Ontario Superior Court justice ruled against the cousins, saying the case was wishful thinking and beyond fanciful. Barry Sherman won, and the judge ordered the cousins to pay him $300,000 in legal costs. The day after Barry and his wife Honey were buried, the lawyer filed an appeal for more money from the cousins. Barry also predicted what would happen to him. He was fully aware he was capable of shitty business practices, and so maybe all these donations and philanthropy kind of kept things in balance in his head. I don't know. In a 2001 book titled Prescription Games: Money, Ego and Power Inside the Pharmaceutical Industry, Barry Sherman discussed the long-running feud between Apotex and Big Pharma over drug patents.
All over the office there are stacks of documents related to litigation, filing cabinets full of them all over the floor as well.
The branded drug companies hate us. They have private investigators on us all the time. The thought once came to my mind, why didn't they hire someone to knock me off? For $1,000 paid to the right person, you can probably get someone killed. Perhaps I'm surprised that hasn't happened. On December 5th, 2017, 2 real estate agents arrived at the Sherman house near the northern edge of Toronto. They were accompanied by a couple who were considering buying the 12,000 square foot mansion recently listed for just under $7 million. The Shermans weren't supposed to be home that day. Walking into the basement where the pool was at the rear of the house, they found them. Barry and Honey were side by side on the floor, their necks tied with leather belts to the metal railing of the pool. Barry was seated, legs extended forward and crossed at the ankles. Honey was slumped on her side and appeared to have been struck in the face. Their arms were drawn back, held in place by coats pulled down below their shoulders. Both were facing away from the water and fully clothed, although one of the belts seemed to have been taken from Barry's trousers. It was impossible to tell how long they'd been dead. Post-mortem examinations showed the cause of both deaths was ligature neck compression, strangulation.
Tonight, the mystery deepening behind the double homicide of one of the world's richest couples.
Their murder has shaken the political establishment, with many wondering who could have wanted to see them dead and why.
Now, the billionaire founder of Canada's largest drugs firm, Barry Sherman, and his wife Honey have been found dead at their home in Toronto. Police describe the deaths as suspicious, but say they were not being treated as murder.
We've discovered 2 bodies of people inside a home here. The circumstances of their death appear suspicious.
Now to the mysterious death of a billionaire couple found hanging inside their mansion. Police are calling the death of pharmaceutical tycoon Barry Sherman and his wife Honey suspicious, saying both were strangled. ABC's Lindsay Janis here. She's tracking the case. Good morning, Lindsay.
Good morning, George. Friends and family are in shock. The couple, the Shermans, were philanthropists. Their company, Apotex, employs thousands of people in Canada and around the world, making hundreds of generic drugs. Now police want to know who would want them dead.
Barry and Honey Sherman were one of the world's wealthiest couples, worth $3.2 billion, thanks to their pharmaceutical empire.
We started Apotex in 1974, almost 40 years ago.
Known for giving tens of millions of dollars to charitable causes.
Remember this. Our parents never left anyone behind. They were taken from us.
Forensic investigators were back at the couple's home today. The Shermans were found there Friday, strangled. CBC News has confirmed they were found beside the pool in the basement and that there are no security cameras in or outside the home. Homicide detectives are leading the investigation, but there is still no indication from police that the deaths are homicides.
Initially, there was no indication of forced entry, and the police, they weren't seeking suspects. The deaths were being treated as a possible murder-suicide, committed by Barry. The children of Barry and Honey were outraged at this. They hired Brian Greenspan, a respected Toronto criminal defense lawyer. Greenspan assembled a team of retired police detectives to conduct a separate investigation and began pushing back publicly against the idea that the absence of broken windows or locks meant the Shermans were alone when they died. There were certainly other ways to get in. The house had 9 entries, and the friends say the couple would think nothing of opening the front door for a stranger who rang the bell. There was also an outdoor lockbox with a compartment for a key, so the Shermans' real estate agent could hold viewings when no one was in. The lone surveillance camera at the house was located, oddly enough, in the pool area, but it hadn't been turned on for a long time, perhaps years. The family also hired a pathologist to conduct second autopsies of the bodies. Among the findings were narrow markings on both victims' wrists, evidence that, although no bindings were found at the scene, their hands had been tied at some point. Also odd was the position of Barry's legs, crossed in front of his body in a manner that hardly suggested the thrashing of a suicide.
The Sherman family felt it appropriate for the public to understand why they believe that it is time for a new initiative. On December 15th, 2017, as you know, Barry and Honey Sherman were discovered in the basement of their home in Toronto. Toronto police attended the scene, and before any investigative or inquiries had taken place, they came to the conclusion and announced to the public that there was no sign of forced entry and that they were not currently seeking any suspects. That misguided, indeed unfounded conclusion left the wrong impression that this was a self-inflicted crime, either a suicide or murder-suicide. That comment set the wheels in motion and conveyed a false sense of security to the public and devastation to the Sherman family. Police are required by law to maintain a certain professional standard in their approach to investigations, but in this case, at this stage of the investigation, the manner in which the Toronto Police Service conducted itself fell well below that standard of how a reasonable officer in similar circumstances should have acted. David Chasen, the retired chief forensic pathologist of Ontario, conducted the second autopsy on Wednesday, December 20th, 2017. The 3 homicide investigators present at this press conference today attended at the autopsy and were provided access to photographs of the crime scene. At the conclusion of Dr. Chasen's post-mortem examinations of Barry and Honey Sherman, it became clear that they were both murdered, and the Toronto Police Service should not have drawn any conclusion which suggested self-inflicted injuries.
The private investigators briefed the police that a murder-suicide couldn't be the explanation for what happened. And more than a month after the bodies were found, the police officially endorsed this view. In January, a homicide detective told reporters that the police were now describing the case as a double homicide investigation, and that both Honey and Barry Sherman were in fact targeted. Asked what had convinced the police, the detective replied, 6 weeks of evidence and its review.
We believe now, through the 6 weeks of work review, we have sufficient evidence to describe this as a double homicide investigation, and that both Honey and Barry Sherman were in fact targeted. We will continue to focus exclusively on evidence with whatever resources are necessary. We ask anyone to come forward with anything they may think is valuable to the investigation, and we, along with the family, are grateful for all those that have done so thus far. Thank you.
He wasn't this loving, kind person giving money away, pillar of the Jewish community. He cared about one thing: money, making lots of it, and not caring who he destroyed, who he stepped on, or who he fucked over, like me and my brothers.
So who killed the Shermans? They had a lot of enemies, from other companies who were less than happy with Apotex's business practices, to extended family members who were bitter over money issues. He even said himself he didn't think it'd be hard to hire someone to take him out. And maybe that's exactly what happened. And the Shermans were pretty open people. They had no security to speak of, so getting access to their home doesn't sound like it would have been that difficult for the killer. The investigation is still continuing. The police are now fairly sure of the double homicide theory. Search warrants have been handed out, and whether they are closer to uncovering what really happened, we don't know. In October 2018, lawyer Brian Greenspan announced that the family had offered a $10 million reward in the couple's murder investigation for any information that leads to the arrest and prosecution of a suspect. Most recently, in April 2019, the Toronto police said they had a working theory on the case and an idea of what happened. What that is, we will just have to wait and see. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please let me know your thoughts on this case down below, and I will see you, as always, real soon in the next video. Take care of yourselves. Mike out.